Good afternoon and welcome to the 2023 National Trust Heritage Trade Show. I'm Jeff Robinson, the moderator for today's panel discussion, and I'm a member of the Heritage Council of Victoria. Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I wish to acknowledge that this event takes place on what always was and always will be the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. The Heritage Council of Victoria are proud sponsors of the 2023 National Trust Heritage Trade Show and the 2023 Australian Heritage Festival in Victoria. Today, we meet to discuss managing the impacts of climate change on heritage places, the future of heritage protection, and how we can ensure that conservation skills are valued and sustained into the future. My experience is in the design of sustainable buildings and the sustainability of heritage buildings. And I work for a company called Aurecon as a principal and sustainable design professional. And I'm also the chair of the Heritage Council's Cultural Heritage and Climate Change Committee. Today I'm joined by Samantha Westbrook, National Trust Conservation Architect, David Young, Heritage Consultant, and Joe Lincoln, Manager of the Emergency and Bushfire Recovery Programme at Heritage Victoria. Welcome to you all, and welcome to everyone in this room. And I know that once you've heard the panel speak, you're going to have so many questions, and I'm a big fan of letting people ask questions. So we're going to run for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be about 15 minutes to go and ask questions at the end. So if you wouldn't mind holding your questions for them, maybe make a note, write them down if you want, and then please, there's a panel of experts here, and don't go away saying, oh, I really wish I'd asked that question. So welcome one and all. So I think we might start off with a kind of a framing question for everyone. Can you share with us some examples of where you have seen the impacts of climate change on heritage? Can I start with you, Sam?
Yes, you can. With the National Trust, we're custodians of around 39 buildings, or 40, shall I say. We've seen a bit of impact a lot of impact from climate change more recently with the storms last year, and was it the year before now? I think it was the year before, yes. So rain weather events with incoming water from overflowing gutters, flat roofs that can't handle these intense weather events. But we've also had trees from storms falling on some of our buildings. So some really direct impacts of climate change on our properties. So, yeah.
David?
Actually, the answer is no, but that's just a comment about the fact that climate change is a progressive thing, and it's hard to separate out, except for the obvious things that Sam's just talked about, it's hard to separate out many of the impacts. For example, the problems of dampness rising in walls have always been there. Climate change is just exacerbating them. So very often we might look at a building and say, well, there's no obvious climate change effect here. But in fact, what climate change is doing is making some of these situations worse.
Absolutely. And Joe?
Yeah, I think in my role, because we were put together in the Emergency and Bushfire Recovery Program to specifically address impacts to places on the Victorian Heritage Register back in March in 2020, and it was as a result of the Black Summer fires. So we have witnessed the impacts on places on the register. I think a really good example of that was we lost, on the register we had 3 timber truss bridges that were registered, and we lost 2 of those in those fires in Gippsland. And the loss of the Genoa Timber Truss Bridge and the Murrundall Timber Truss Bridge left the Hinnamungi Timber Truss Bridge as the only one remaining on the register. So all of a sudden it sort of brought the spotlight onto that particular structure, which was in pretty poor shape and which had also been threatened by the fires. And I guess, you know, that was a real awakening for us of just how quickly things can change. We also lost, those fires were horrific. There was 1.5 million hectares that was impacted, and 88 heritage inventory places, which is archaeological sites, as well as 16 VHR places, which were directly or indirectly impacted. So we lost a fire spotting tower on Stringer's Knob, which was an amazing structure, no longer used, but its history and its social significance in Gippsland was amazing, hence it was on the state register. And, you know, there was the Towong Hill homestead that was also lost, which was not on the register but was of such social significance in Towong. Climate change, I think the intensity of those fires was, I think we can attribute that to how things have changed, the fact that we'd gone through 7 years of quite extreme drought and the growth patterns. So, yeah, we have seen it, and more recently with the floods across central and northern Victoria.
Thanks, Jo. And just, I suppose, building on your point, David, I mean, these climate change is, we've seen obviously the impacts as they are at the moment, but we know that events are going to get more extreme, and I'm just interested in everyone's view on what you reckon the most pressing concerns are for heritage in the face of climate change.
Well, I think, it's, one of the points I'd like to make is that it's not just heritage, it's every building. And so it's just how we maintain our buildings. And I think the pressing challenge is to maintain our buildings so they can combat these more severe weather events and fires. So I just think it's a challenge to keep looking at how our buildings are performing, and to review and to reevaluate why the impacts are happening, how they're happening, and then look at how we can maintain our buildings or adapt our buildings to combat that.
David?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sam has just said it.
Yeah.
In short, maintenance.
Okay.
3 priorities.
Yes.
Jo?
Yeah, that was my number one, was maintenance. Maintaining our buildings and having them ready for some of these extreme rain events, for example. But also, I think, reviewing, as Sam was alluding to, how our buildings can manage, a sudden downpour. Are our gutters big enough? Are the downpipes big enough? Do we have good rainwater goods with our heritage buildings? The buildings are amazingly resilient in themselves, but they were constructed at a different time and under different conditions. But our heritage is not just buildings, it's also cultural landscapes, it's also archaeological sites right across the state. So there are so many different conditions that are attached to this.
Yes, and sorry, I'd probably like to add, we need to start addressing the problems that we already had before we had the problems, and maintaining our buildings and looking after our buildings, how they should be looked after in the first place. As David alluded to or said, our buildings already have rising damp issues because we're not managing them properly, we're not maintaining them properly, we're not understanding how our buildings need to perform already without the impact of climate change and them becoming more intense. So I think we need to just start to look at our buildings and our landscapes and care for them in the way they should be cared for in the first instance before, and that will make them more resilient to change.
And what do you think that the current public understanding of the impacts of climate change on heritage is like? Do you think there is a good understanding?
I think, I think there's a fear. I think everybody looks at a heritage building and they think it's too hard. So I think they think that heritage is going to be something that suffers as a result of climate change because they think that it can't adapt. I don't think they understand heritage and its resilience already, and that it's part of our climate action fight, really, because they're existing buildings. They were built and there was a lot of care that went into them and how to make them sustainable. I mean, they've been here for hundreds of years. Why can't we make them or review them or look after them so they're still sustainable? And I don't think... I think there's a bit of fear of dealing with heritage, and I think that's what the community sees.
David?
There's also a lack of understanding of building construction practice and materials. Most of our heritage buildings are pre-Second World War, not all of them, but most, and with the Second World War came major changes in building practice, and those changes have sped up since. And so designers, architects, engineers, and builders and tradespeople, anyone who's working today has been trained long since the Second World War. So they've been trained on contemporary materials and construction. So as well as the owners of the buildings, the professionals often lack understanding of the materials and the construction techniques of the buildings themselves, and that is a problem for us.
Yeah, and I'll come to a question later on maladaption, because I think that's certainly an issue in there. Joe, do you see sort of what from in your role and working in communities and so on? Do you understand? Do you think that there's a where do you think the current public understanding of the impacts of climate change are?
I think for the general public, I think there's a touch of this won't happen to me with floods and fires. And it's very much, but still there's that compassion for those that are going through it. It's very much an experiential thing, I think. To experience the threat of fires or to experience flooding, both of those events, for example, are very different. We found with the fires, for example, the community response was very different to the communities that we've been working with floods. With the fires, the community needed time, and unfortunately what happened straight after those fires was COVID, and it meant that communities that had gone through the fires couldn't get together and meet at the pub and talk about their experience. And it also meant that we couldn't get out to them for some time. And in lots of ways that was a good thing, because it made us step back and not walk in with our size 15 boots and trample through communities that were suffering and were traumatised by that event. Whereas with the floods, it's a long-term thing. I mean, any event has a 3 to 5 year recovery period, and that's one of the hardest things for communities to understand. It takes that time to to start to rebuild or to respond to whatever it is that happens. With a fire, it's gone, it's done. The fire takes whatever the fire is going to take. And with, however, with floods, it's a long-term thing that we're seeing as we're going through the various areas. You know, it's the flood comes in and it goes, the building's still standing, but it's having to deal with the aftermath of what that flooding has applied to it. The communities, the owners and the managers are having to deal with that very long-term period of time. And I think unless you're in there and you've experienced it, for the general public, it's really hard for them to understand the trauma that's associated with that.
Yeah, I think going forward, you know, I think there's going to be a lot of heritage buildings in particular communities that have great significance to those communities that will need work done now to protect them for the future. And I'd just be interested in your perspectives on you know, that kind of understanding of what is potentially, I suppose this was really coming on to that kind of, that public understanding of what's coming down the line, and that how communities may need to come together to protect those places that are special to them and their history and you know, I think a lot of seeing some of the work that's being done in other places, and there is a lot of work on making communities aware of what potential risk is and then bringing them together to actually help solve some of those problems. And I think, Joe, you've kind of alluded to some of those issues that are starting to, that preparation that's happening. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit further on that kind of preparation that's coming in with communities coming together, and what kind of information needs to be provided?
I think it's really early days in this fight. And from our perspective with the work that we've been doing, we have been trying to sort of get our heads around what it is that we've been confronted with. For example, with the fires, most of the impact was across Crown land and reserve land because it was bush. You know, it's national parks, and that's where the fires in Victoria seem to travel predominantly, and the communities and the townships were protected. So we were dealing a lot with archaeological sites that are found within those reserves and parks. Our relationship with the managers of Crown land, which was predominantly Parks Vic and Delport, which is Deakin now, was sort of a bit at arm's length, which was really interesting because we're in the same department. But Heritage Victoria is primarily metrocentric, and there was a lot of places out there that we, Heritage Vic, hadn't been to. So the work that we were doing was, you know, the first time somebody had seen somebody from government for, you know, a number of years. The preparation for these places, say from the fire's point of view, and archaeological sites, was talking to the land managers about, you know, vegetation, getting vegetation back from our archaeological sites, which are on the Victorian Heritage Registers, so they're very significant. And also having an awareness of their historic heritage within reserves and parks, which was fairly low down on their priority list. But it was interesting when I was talking to them about the fires in the first instance. I said, look, you know, I was almost apologising for the fact that I was making any demands on them, the firefighters and the management staff. And they said, no, we know that historic heritage is so important to communities that have been impacted by an event such as this, because once they've gotten over their own personal trauma, they're turning around and looking for that little hall down the road that is historic. That's where the weddings have happened and the gatherings have happened in the community. And they're needing to see those anchor points in the landscape that talk to them about their history and their you know, their lives. But preparing for that, we're still getting our heads around it. You know, it's incredibly difficult from our point of view. All we can do is come up with the resources to advise property owners and managers, which we're working on at the moment. We have a terrific program with the Heritage Council at the moment where we're looking at setting up a risk assessment for property owners, very basic, very easy to understand in plain English, and so that property owners can undertake an assessment themselves of their place. If they're living on the coast, have a look at what the relationship with your property is with the coast. Are you going to be suffering from coastal erosion and storm events? If you're in a bushfire area, have a look at what you need to do to protect yourself. Storm and flood, you know, how are your gutters and your downpipes, how's your maintenance, and all of those sorts of things. So we have a very baseline approach to providing resources. And I think for us, that's our main drive at the moment.
Thanks very much. Sam, I've talking about preparing for climate change. Part of that is having a really good climate change action plan, and I've read the National Trust Climate Change Action Plan. That's a good one, and it's a very comprehensive document. And I was wondering how you're applying it to the many properties the National Trust looks after. What's going well, and what are some of the challenges which you're facing?
Yes, well, our climate action plan is our first one, and that's always going to be a bit of a test case scenario, and it's definitely that. But it's been amazing to have it because if anything, it's a wonderful communications tool, and to start testing what we're doing. So it's been a great tool to start the conversation about climate action with our properties. I can't say, so it's challenging as well because one of the main actions, well, our first action was to do an emissions audit, and that is a massive task for an organisation that looks after 40 properties, and some of them are farm properties with a number of buildings, cultural landscapes. So we've sort of tripped at the first post because we haven't been able to do that emissions audit yet. So addressing our carbon emissions, so getting the data is one of the main issues with dealing with climate action. You need that data to then test it against what you can achieve and how you can cut back on your carbon emissions. And it's also interesting that it also reassures us that as an organisation, we're cash strapped. No, we don't have huge operational costs. We don't do a lot of stuff that is producing carbon emissions, and also we're quite of an unusual organisation that our properties, a lot of them aren't operational daily. They're house museums, and there's no other organisations we compare ourselves to say what are our carbon emissions. But then we're also, it's quite hard to look at all our operations is a really big part of, and people and how they interact with the buildings and use them is a massive part of how to manage climate action as well, because the users of the buildings are the ones who can really impact on that. And we have a lot of lessees of our buildings or corporates who come in, and so we do so many operations that trying to get a handle on all of that is quite a task in itself. So we've sort of got our climate action plan, but we need to sort of go back to first principles and work out who we are and what we do to sort of control it a bit and tackle it bit by bit. So if that...
Just building on that for a second, when you think about you are a very strong membership organisation, and I suppose you're trying to understand what your emissions are at the moment, but you've also got aspects of preparing for resilience and preparing for extreme weather events and so on. And you bring up the issue of things costing more to do. I suppose my question is going to be around the outreach and the communication with your members on what those impacts are, what's coming down the line, and potentially how they can help. Have you started that process, or are you planning to, or?
Yes, so education
Yeah.
is a big part of a climate action plan, and this is what we're here for today. Because, yes, one of the things that's also reassuring, and something that we probably didn't write in our climate action plan, is we're doing lots of things already as a conservation heritage organisation that other people can learn from to say this is how we combat climate change. So yes, it's about communication, education, and yeah, we're getting there. This is all part of that.
So, you could sort of envisage a future where, I can come to Labassa and I can actually see in this building here, a sheet that sort of talks about, what the potential risks are, and in this particular case, what you're doing, and then maybe particular campaigns to go and, that the public your members can get behind. Is that kind of
yes,
part of the plan on a property by property basis? Maybe?
Yes, it is a sort of a communications plan, and something about, so we've got the Como approach, but I won't go into great detail, but it's about using our buildings as a case study so people can learn from what we're doing, and that's part of the climate action plan as well. So people can look at our climate action plan and go, oh, this is a heritage organisation that's prepared a climate action plan. This is how we can do it as well. Or we'll talk to the National Trust and what are their issues with it and how are they learning from it. So yes, we would love to be able to communicate that and make it part of one of the actions in the climate action plan is to incorporate sustainability and climate change resilience as part of our interpretation, as part of the tour, consistent messaging in our tours of our properties, talking about that.
I think that's really powerful, because I think being able for people to understand what, say, extreme weather events are going to have on fabric or moisture, or floods, or on landscape. When I go around and I look at a lot of beautiful heritage landscapes around Victoria and things there, and I talk to some of the owners of those places there, and I say, so what are your plans for the changing climate and for the landscape that's there? Some have great plans and others are perhaps on that journey. Are you seeing that? When we talk about your plans, are they for the fabric but also your landscapes as well?
Definitely for our landscapes, and also the contribution our landscapes already make to combating climate change, carbon dioxide emissions, soaking those up.
Sure.
and talking about the environmental ability of our heritage sites and our gardens. Like, our gardens are a big part of what we do at the Trust, and so that's also contributing. So yes, we are looking into all of that, and sustainable farming. We've got a lot of different properties that we can tell the story about, or start having the conversation about climate action. Murrumong, we've got a nature reserve there, and we're entering into potential agreements about a nature reserve and getting species back into the environment, and grasslands and all those sorts of things. So
they're very powerful, positive stories, but are you also prepared to go and sort of talk about those things that you tried, had a go, and there are lessons learned from those things?
Absolutely. I think we learn more from our mistakes than our wins, and I think that's it is really powerful to talk about where we might have gone wrong. Even communicating how we wrote a climate action plan 3 years ago, and some of the things we said we might do haven't worked, and just talking about that's where we're going to learn. So yeah.
I think it's really powerful. Joe, just asking you, in your role as the manager of bushfire recovery, you've seen the impacts of climate change at first hand on heritage properties. Could you talk a little bit about some of the, and you've spoken already, but perhaps a little bit more on some of the short-term measures you've had to put in place to protect properties under immediate risk, whilst developing long-term strategies for protection? And maybe you could talk about it both for what you've had to do for bushfires and also maybe the stuff you're doing at the moment around floods.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting concept that we would be protecting, putting in place things. I guess our main drive with the work that we're doing is to provide the resources for owners and managers to put in place those protections. As I say, it's very early days, and when our particular team is responding to an event, it's the initial stages is all about gathering the data and trying to understand what has happened, and responding to the immediate emergency. So we tend to be funded through those emergency budgets that come out very rapidly to support communities. And so our work is focused very much on responding to that immediate situation. For example, with the floods, we had a huge amount of resources available to us through DELP, or DECA as it's now known, and access to mapping for the floods as it actually happened and moved across the landscape. We were able to track what places were within that flood footprint. We knew what heritage buildings and structures and archaeological sites were being immediately impacted. We then had to sit back and wait until the floods had receded, and also get a sense of what the community feeling was like before we once again marched in with our very heavy boots. And then one of the things that we put in place fairly quickly was a heritage specialist panel, people that were right across quite a broad base. David is one of those panel members for us. We have a conservation architect, somebody that's also very well versed in mould and impacts on papers, etc. Also a conservation builder and a structural engineer. So we've been sort of marching across the landscape with this fabulous group of people informing us. And one of the things that we'll be doing or a number of things that we'll be doing from that process is to set up some guidelines for flood, but also for other events, and a series of technical notes. So for Heritage Victoria, it's about providing the resources for our property owners to enable them to pick up the challenge of preparing their places. And providing case studies and an understanding of what flood means. Don't panic, things, it's a process. What bushfire means, yes, panic, get out of there, move on very quickly, and what the consequences of those different events are. We've also dealt with big, heavy wind events, where we've had, for example, in the Wombat State Forest, just these massive trees collapsing onto archaeological sites. And so we're having to work with forestry with the way that they're removing the trees and, dragging them off the sites. And so there's a whole range of processes that we have to put in place to protect the fabric of whether it's landscape archaeology or built the structures. Have I answered your question?
You have, I'll tighten it up a little bit because I've seen some photographs of I think things like heritage huts and
Yes.
things in different places which were wrapped in material, reflective material to protect that. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of process? When that happens, who does it?
Yep.
Does the community get involved? That kind of,
Yeah.
it's kind of, there's got to be a plan in place, but it seems to be, it would have to be quite quick and immediate, and how that kind of decision making gets made to do that kind of protection. Could you let us behind the curtain on some of those things?
Yeah, the huts was a really good example, and we take no credit for that. That was Parks Victoria. They sourced a material from America, I think, David. It's a foil wrap that they placed around some of the timber huts in the Alpine region, and I have a personal experience of that, and I'll share something. I mean, this is a massive failure on my part. I saw the use of this foil and thought, aha, isolation. I have a property at Swifts Creek, which is in northeast Victoria. As soon as we were able to get up there, because the fires were coming at us from all directions, my family, we wrapped the house up in foil and isolation. And I learnt later that, no, that doesn't work. I had some in a bucket with some coals, and I looked at how it had all just shriveled up. So it's lack of information and lack of understanding, whereas the stuff that Parks Vic were using was this special material that reflected the radiant heat, stopped the windows from exploding and letting the fire in, and a fabulous material, but massively expensive for private people to couldn't access it and couldn't afford to. So there are all those things that we learn very, very quickly when we're faced with, this looming disaster that's about to hit us. There's one of the other sites that I was fortunate enough to work on back in 2011 was Port Arthur Historic Site. I was a conservation manager down there. And at that time we had a storm that impacted the penitentiary, which I'm sure you've all seen these beautiful images of the penitentiary at Port Arthur. And it was a low pressure system, it was a king tide and a massive storm that came through, and we had the waves breaking over the seawall and crashing against the penitentiary, and it's salt water. And the penitentiary has its feet half on rock and half on reclaimed land, and has always suffered, as David says, from salt attack and all of the things that are associated with that. But the water eventually got trapped inside the penitentiary and sat there for 2 or 3 weeks, just soaking up the salts and having a wonderful time. And the scouring across the masonry was horrific, from the literally sandstone blocks being picked up and thrown at it by this wave effect. We, at the time, realised that this was something that was going to continue to happen down there. So we undertook a structural assessment, did a whole lot of structural stabilisation of the ruin, and then changed the levels of the ground around it to get the water away a lot better. But speaking of maladaptation, the changes to that building prior to it being a ruin was it went from a mill, flour mill, to a penitentiary. Subfloor vents were blocked up, and a whole lot of other stuff happened to the structure itself that stopped it from getting rid of moisture and water that was sitting there. And we've been finding, as we've marched across the landscape in Victoria, that there have been a number of issues associated with buildings with subfloor ventilation, vents being blocked up because ground levels have been raised, structures have been placed around the buildings, and So there's a whole range of issues that we're discovering that we can now start to discuss and to pass on to owners and managers.
Thanks, Joe. David, just building on some of those themes, many heritage buildings are constructed using traditional materials and forms of construction, and care must be taken to avoid maladaptation when improving resilience to extreme weather events, which are becoming more frequent due to climate change. Given the mounting pressure to prepare for climate change, what's your experience with the prevalence of heritage maladaptation regarding heritage building techniques?
So this goes back to the maintenance word again, but also to what I was saying before about the changes in building practice. That people, in most cases, thinking they're doing the right thing, put the wrong paint on or use the wrong approach to managing rising damp in the walls, whatever. And they are in fact making the situation worse. Joe mentioned the sites we've been looking at flood-wise. One of those is a building which has had a disabled access ramp built hard up against the wall in masonry, and the dampness now goes, you can follow the line of dampness in the wall up the ramp and then along and then down the other side. And as well as adding to the dampness, it's blocking ventilation under the floor and so on. So again, this comes back to a lack of understanding about traditional materials, the fact that traditional masonry, bricks, stones and the mortar between them is often quite porous, and we need to understand that. What that means is that the walls exchange air with the atmosphere, they breathe, and if we do anything to stop that, like putting modern paint on the surface, we're going to create problems. And again, this is an issue with the ordinary maintenance of buildings, and not just heritage buildings, as Sam says, all buildings, all old buildings. We need to understand how their materials behave, and therefore how to look after them. And that's the challenge in terms of people who've learnt on contemporary materials. The three worst things that can happen to old buildings are: 1, Portland cement, 2, acrylic paint, and 3, project managers. Now, to project managers present, you're here, so you're not part of that group that I'm referring to. But it's a real issue. Managing work on heritage buildings without understanding their materials and their construction is bound to cause problems.
So if can you get your hand? Just take this for a second. Okay, so just grab that. It's a magic wand, okay? What I want you to do is answer the question, what more can be done, given your magic wand, what more can be done to educate the heritage and construction industry about how to, inverted commas, safely improve the resilience of heritage buildings and avoid maladaptation?
Well, education, as Cam said before, and Joe's talked about in response to floods and fires, Heritage Victoria preparing technical notes, advisory material to help people. This event and others like it. Part of the issue is that often, and somebody mentioned before, I think Joe mentioned it before, often people don't engage with the subject until the flood is right there. And that's an issue. I think part of the Heritage Council's role is an educational one. And so thank you, Heritage Council, for being here and for supporting this event. I think it's very much about education.
And just building on that, I mean, one of the things about educating is, you know, this is a broad community in People and Heritage. You have heritage advisors, you have engineers and architects who work in the space, sometimes knowingly or unknowingly, as in, you know, there are engineers and architects who are perhaps not as tuned into heritage solutions. What are your sort of thoughts? And then obviously, while we're all here, a lot of the folk who are the tradespeople with the special skills in that kind of area, do you think we're kind of working together well enough as a community, all the different parts working well enough together? And what more do you think could be done? Anyone?
Well, I think it's education. You know, it's having the systems in place that support the you know, it's coming like a train through the tunnel, the loss of those skills, the conservation skills that we have out there. We're all getting a lot older, and in my career, I've seen so many wonderful practitioners and contractors, you know, who've just retired, and they're having trouble with bringing their workers through, and with that same commitment, and I think, you know, we've lost amazing courses that are associated with the universities that, you know, are practical and pragmatic, and rather than, you know, I believe one of the issues that we found when we first started working on this was we spoke to the woman down at Port Arthur who was looking at climate change and how they, across their many sites, could start to respond to this. And Caitlin said there's such a massive amount of research out there that is about all of these issues, but there's a paralysis from the research to putting it into practice, because people are terrified of doing the wrong thing, so nothing gets done. And whereas since we've been in this role, we have started to see that paralysis lessen and more happening in that space. But I think it's all about education and financially supporting institutions to put in place the training that's needed with, you know, for contractors and consultants.
Okay. I'm just conscious that I want the audience to have that opportunity to go and ask some questions. So this is the last question for each of you. What is one piece of advice that you would give to owners or custodians of heritage properties to help them prepare for the impacts of climate change on their properties?
Maintenance.
Maintenance.
Well, that's consistent.
Can I just say something on the last point?
Please do.
I think it's really important that we make heritage and the discussion of conservation really accessible, because if we keep it at this academic level and in the institutions, we're still missing most of our heritage custodians who are out there looking after their properties, and just as Joe said, they're fearful, they think they're going to do the wrong thing. But if it's part of the general conversation that there's some simple things you can do to look after your building, to keep it, to take water away, like not to build garden beds up against your walls, not to put concrete in right against your walls, to do your maintenance regimes, to check your gutters.
And do you think that's available now, today, to people, or is that a piece of work that needs to
That's a
be
piece
done?
of, I think it's beginning. I think it's a piece of work that needs to be done. I think it's about being really open and honest about talking about our mistakes and just making it a lot more accessible to people that you don't, building owners, they shouldn't need engage a heritage consultant to get a tradesperson in. We're not going to value our heritage tradespeople unless the people who own the properties know to use a tradesperson with the heritage skills. So, and to know that and feel comfortable talking to that tradesperson and knowing that that tradesperson isn't taking them for a ride, if you know what I mean? Because
Sure.
there's
So you're not getting that if we say something like maladaption, we're saying something, somebody says, oh, look, you need to replace those windows. You know, there's rotten there, and you know, they just need
And
to
they
go.
and they don't understand. They don't go, well, actually, no, I don't need to replace it. I know that can be repaired. If I've got a skilled tradesperson, they can take that window away, replace that little bit, and bring me back a window that's got most of its original fabric, and it works beautifully because
So more TikTok videos.
yeah.
And it'll be double noticed.
Yeah, it'll be done.
Yes. So I think it's about educating the public, but not making it like rocket. It's not rocket science. This stuff isn't rocket science. It's easy. We just need to talk to people and I mean, and who was I can't remember who I was talking to during the week, but lots of people. Bring the enjoyment back to heritage so people, if they understand that what they own is part of their history, part of the community's history, then they start to go, oh, but I really want to look after this. I want to know how I can look after this properly. So I think it's just about bringing back the joy to heritage, and I think
that's a wonderful way to end this part of the discussion. Now, this is an amazing opportunity. You have 3 experts up here. Don't blow it. Can we have some questions? Who would like to ask the first question? And if you wouldn't mind, when you do ask the question, would you mind just introducing you, or just saying who your name is, if that would be okay?
Yes, there's a couple of things there. I've been involved with the museum, excuse me, John Wall is my name, from Hastings.
Thanks.
And from down at Port Welshpool. And over the years, I've been involved with working on buildings and maritime history on a boat. Wooden boat business is also a very keen interest of mine. And for a start, I would say I've heard all these conversations for the last 40 years. The only difference is we are adding the words climate change to it. The lack of funding, the lack of interest, the academic approach to things. So the way I'm seeing at the moment, the answer is to go to the lowest level of government and influence them. It has to be shire councils. They're the ones that relate to the people. Now, if the shire council is controlled by the insurance company, and I'm rather interested to know where insurance companies fit into Heritage Victoria's decision making, because shire councils dance to the tune of insurance companies. That's how they get the cheapest lot number to cover everything. So the insurance companies say, well, we want all those trees chopped down or that, and you'll need to put concrete there and not have wood because that's a fire-prone business, and so it all goes on. And I think by going to the shire councils and having them re-educate them, because they like to build art galleries and all the new things that are attractive to the modern person. If you could get to them to produce a sense of ownership to the people, then you'll start to make improvements. Otherwise, at 80 years of age, I won't be around to hear what you're saying, or your people that follow you, because you could well be saying the same stuff. So I don't know whether all that makes sense, but
Just turning that into a bit of a question for the role of insurance and things like that. Well, do you want to make a commentary on what John said?
To kick off at that, really good point, insurance companies, and really good point about the local government authorities. With the work that we've been doing, the experience we've had with insurance companies has been quite varied. We had one insurance company who immediately put on a heritage special advisor before they even touched anything, as well as a number of contractors that then they called us in to provide advice. Whereas other insurance companies are taking that very, just get it done, get in, get out, and the practices are less than desirable. Local government, we have had quite a lot of trouble getting to the people that we need to within local government, because local government are the custodians of a huge number of heritage buildings. Echuca, for example, massive number. They own the pubs and the hotels and the, you know, the information centre, and they had lessees in there. And to be completely honest about this, we had a lot of trouble engaging with the local government authorities for some of them. Once we got in there and we could actually start to talk to them about what their obligations are as owners and managers, but also provide advice as to how they could respond better perhaps in the future. They were really keen to get on board and to engage with that. One of the things that we're looking at before the end of June is to have a local government authority forum for those councils that have been immediately impacted by the floods, so that our panel can come in and actually have a chat to them about some of the things, the before, the during and the after the event, that, you know, they can start to respond to. But local government, you're completely right. They're the ones that are at the grassroots. They're the ones that have to face the people walking through the door with the significant questions.
Yeah. Can I say something about
Please
local
do.
government?
Please
In
do.
my other life, I'm a local government heritage advisor, and I've been working with Corangamite Shire, and so I think this goes back to the whole inquiries about local government's responsibility with heritage. Most of our heritage is protected at a local government area level, and as Joe says, they're custodians, they're committees of management for a number of heritage places, a lot of places on the Heritage Register, and it's about funding heritage experts to go and work with councils, not just in the planning department. I do most of my work for Corangamite Shire in the building department now, and I help them do applications to Heritage Victoria and talk to them about, they're very receptive to it. So working with the building team, the engineering team, so it's about having heritage professionals working across the whole organisation, and that is really important because planning is only one part of heritage. And these are local governments, major custodians, and they need to, I've done a lot of talking about local government and the power of being embedded in the community. I think, yes, you're right, it happens at the community, the local level. And I can't remember, I've lost my train of thought, but yes, educating them, and they need to lead by example. If they want their own constituents to look after their heritage, they need to lead by example and be the ones that are showing people how to do it. Because, as you say, locals go to their local government for advice, and a lot of the times it's not there. We used to have a wonderful local heritage program when it was funded by state government a number of years ago, which has fallen by the wayside. So, yes.
Well, I can certainly say the Heritage Council has been working to help local councils to give them really great material to go and help them have conversations with their local communities about heritage and the value of heritage, and so those resources and materials, because we understand that councils are often doing things on the small and oily rag to try and keep things going, and that they need help to understand those issues. So I think thank you for your point, Sean. It's really well made.
Yeah.
And there's still another opportunity to go and ask some questions. Please.
So, my name's Dashana, and I'm a student in my final year of a Bachelor of Interior Architecture. And I guess my question would be, what advice can you give to a student, especially seeing as I feel like I'm one of the only ones in my sort of cohort that's interested in heritage and trying to preserve it. So what would your advice be to students and how to get more interest?
That's a great question, and lucky you that you're the person there. You have a bright future, but I'll ask panelists, what advice would you give? Please, David.
I could take that up. Look, I think part of the answer is look for architecture firms who are working in heritage and seek them out. as places to work. There are, and this is a slightly commercial introduction, there's an organisation called the Longford Academy, which is...
Tell us about the Longford Academy.
The Longford Academy is a bunch of old guys. Not entirely true. It's a group of heritage specialist architects, engineers, tradespeople. One of them is doing plastering things out there, and another one's a stonemason who's around today. And Longford comes from Longford, Tasmania, where we go twice a year and run training courses for anybody and everybody. And in fact, we're off there in a week's time to run another training course. And we seek to bring together architects and engineers and stonemasons and carpenters and plasterers in the group so that everybody benefits from the interaction. And it's the only program like it in Australasia. So find out about that. But first find a place to work that specialises in it. That's the best thing. And of course, presumably you're already a member of the National Trust.
Deshana's doing all the right things. I've been speaking to her a lot today. She's also volunteering and just getting involved and finding the people. And as you'll find, heritage professionals and tradespeople are very happy to talk about their trade and just talk to people. Yeah, and ICOMOS is another great. Do an ICOMOS plug, and there's an emerging professionals group also. But yeah.
Fantastic. I'm just conscious that we're getting close to the end of our hour, but it's time for one more question. So who's going to ask the last question? Yes, please.
You did briefly mention, sorry, my name's Maddie. You did briefly mention heritage as an asset for climate action. I just wondered if you could provide some examples of that. Heritage buildings as sort of sustainable assets.
Because they exist.
Yes, I was going to say they're all
Already here.
In a embodied energy sense.
Yeah.
The most sustainable building is the one that already exists. The challenge for us is to keep it that way, to understand how it works and to maintain it so that it continues to work.
I think I'm not on the panel, but I'll have a go at answering your question as well, which is that, if we think about where we are at the moment on climate change, we can't afford to continue building new buildings all the time. We have to adapt them. And oftentimes the conversations that we have are around, when we think heritage, we think very much around traditional buildings. The thing about heritage is it's what every generation values. And we're now on the council listing things like Federation Square or 1 Spring Street or 1 Nicholson Street, buildings that or some of the mid-century modern buildings. So they're heritage buildings as well. And I think just as when we started off talking about maintenance and what has to be done, I think what we need to think about in the life cycle of any kind of a building, when you start off with a building, build it well and build it that it's adaptable and build it that it's a beautiful building that people will love it over a long period of time. Because buildings can change and adapt, and I think the big challenge for us now is to get everyone working together really well. So when you have a heritage building, you actually understand how that building is constructed and what its specific needs are to maintain it over a period of time. Because a solution for a wooden building or a stone building is going to be different from a 1950s concrete building. Or even when we start listing some of the exceptional buildings that are being built now in maybe 30 years' time, what you have to do for that. And I think the secret is having the discipline of folk coming together to understand both the building physics and the traditional skills and the emerging skills that will be required to maintain and preserve those things that are important to us. So I think that's a great question to ask, and I think this is very, very, very much an emerging area, and my personal view is that the way in which we tackle it is by people, the trades and the professions, and just house owners having a greater awareness and importance of not just throwing away, but actually adapting and changing and flexing, because I think that's going to be part of the overall solution.
Yeah, there's if I can add, there's the throwaway society, if you like, the change from repairing things when they break down to throwing it away and getting a new one. I think that's part of our overall problem in terms of looking after buildings.
You know, it's interesting, David. I think what's going to happen over the next number of years is as we become more and more carbon constrained in our society, you know, we are moving towards renewable energy, but what a lot more of that happening. But what that will do in a situation whereby, you know, things are going to be more constrained, and we will not be able to go and say, okay, we're going to build a new building, because society will say, well, actually, that's a lot of carbon you're putting into that building there. There's a cost associated with that. That's not now, but that's where it's heading to. Yep. And I think more and more, there's going to be a greater value given to buildings because of their embodied carbon. And I think the thing is to have those skill sets to understand how to repair, how to maintain, and how to adapt and change buildings, so that we can you know, adapt to where our climate is heading, both in extreme weather events and the prevention, what we need to do to avoid having carbon emissions, both operational. So I think there needs to be a situation where heritage buildings don't get a free pass. If it's a heritage, even if it's a traditional building, look at the techniques that work with that building, that still allow it to breathe, but are providing the kind of comfort conditions that will be required in the future and things of that. So.
And I completely agree. I think we're about to have conversations within the heritage industry where we start to change perhaps some of our philosophical approaches and review. I think we really need to shake things up and to really have a good hard think about some of the approaches that we have had to heritage. I know that people who own a heritage place or, you know, manage it, and especially when they're confronted with Heritage Victoria, their immediate reaction is, oh, it's heritage, we can't do anything. So they sort of use that as a bit of an excuse to walk away and not maintain it and not undertake certain works. And especially adaptive reuse, I think, is critical for the future, you know, in order to ensure that we don't walk past a heritage building for a vacant block of land and construct something when that building could be so easily used for a multitude of purposes.
Well, look, I think, sorry, did you want to
So
ask
I just want to make a final statement that we talk about impacts on heritage, but really we should be saying heritage is climate action.
100%.
It is the thing.
Well, look, thank you very much, Sam, David and Joe, for your imparting your wisdom. And thank you as the audience for asking some great questions and for being here and for supporting this weekend. And I'd also like to thank the National Trust for putting on this Heritage Festival. I think it's really, really important work from an education point of view. And also I'd like to thank the Heritage Council for supporting this event. Enjoy the rest of your visit.